time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, our leader, Hugh Taft-Morales. And the title of his talk is, What Do You Really Own Anyway?
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Special morning before our members' pledge luncheon afterwards. Sorry there won't be a talk back today, but I'm happy to talk about this topic with anyone. I'm going to start the topic by talking about ownership, focusing on the legal definition. Like most of you, I move along through life relatively ignorant of the intricacies of property law and how it protects our stuff, but I do, despite my ignorance, rely on the concept of private property and on our system of law enforcement that lets me sleep at night without a lot of fear of being robbed. And that, I just want to acknowledge, that's a privilege that I have that I take for granted way too often. We don't live in a country where people, A, necessarily sleep sure that they will not be robbed, or B, even have anything to be taken. So we have a long ways to go before forgetting that. Now, philosophically, I believe that ownership, at least how we discuss it in general, is a social construction. I agree with the philosopher David Hume, who said that there's nothing natural about private property. Ownership in a legal sense is, quote, exclusive rights and control over property. Exclusive ownership is often assured by the state. Property can be gained by finding it, giving it, having it given, inheriting it. You could make something, you could buy something. You can lose property if you misplace it or sell it or exchange it, or if it's taken by somebody else or by the state. The types of things that the state acknowledges can be owned are usually divided into three categories. The first is personal property. It's also called movable property, and it is what it implies. Things that you exclusively have the right to control, which can be moved from one place to another. Clothing, a cell phone, a comb, a car. There's also a second type of property, which is real estate, which by definition can't be moved from one place to another. And the third type of property that is acknowledged by the state is intellectual property, which is complex. So usually it's an idea or a design designated by the state as distinct and unique. Copyright law usually covers creative and artistic works, whereas patents usually involve some sort of invention that is, quote, new, useful, and not simply an obvious advancement. Trademarks are a subset of intellectual property, and it's usually a sign or a design signifying a specific service or product. Now, obviously, that's an oversimplified list of things that you can own, and it avoids the really tough questions like, can you own another human being, as was the case made by many slaveholders in the chattel slave area, and also, can you own today life itself? Because people do own patents for created life, genetically modified life. So those are, in some ways, deep questions I don't have time to talk about today too much. As far as who can own anything, things can be owned individually by any one of us or by membership in a group. And things can also be owned by everyone in terms of common property, things that the state usually curates, like the sidewalks, the streets, the parks, things like that, or things that can't be easily bound and controlled, like sunshine, common property. Now, group ownership is the social construction that most accelerated our focus on ownership in our very materialistic, complex, and industrialized world. And this is why I think it really came into existence, because when the state grants exclusive control over property, the owners enjoy certain privileges, but they also inherit a set of liabilities. And those liabilities can be two forms. One is a legal liability of being responsible for any damage your property might cause. So if you were a horse owner and the horse kicked somebody, you're responsible legally for that damage. And the other liability you have with property is quite often it involves a large financial risk, that you must make a hefty investment in something in order to try to make money. And during the age of exploration, this was particularly the case because explorations were notoriously expensive, and while they could reap great rewards, they were uncertain. So, in order to avoid those two types of liability, the creation of joint stock companies accelerated capitalism's emphasis on property. Investors could risk a small amount because they pooled together their capital with other people. So that was one way you escaped financial liability. But legal liability was also somewhat framed by legal wording of limited liability. So this led to an explosion of economic activity because you didn't have to be responsible for the death of the sailors on the ship on the exploration that you were invested in. And you were shielded from, as an owner, from being sued for that. And this led to a lot of wealthy people and a lot of wealthy nation states. Now, while the Philadelphia Ethical Society is not a capitalist enterprise seeking mainly to maximize its profits or protect its shareholders, we do benefit from the model of collective ownership that was developed by entrepreneurs. Our board members are legal representatives of our corporate body, and for that I thank them heartily because they actually are exposed to the most risk legally. But our liability is borne primarily by the corporation. That's why it's set up. So if we're sued, it's the corporation that is going to be held most likely responsible. Financially, our members, not all of you here, are not responsible for funding everything, for keeping the lights going. Everybody puts in a little bit. So this collective ownership spreads out the financial risk. And the assets of the Philadelphia Ethical Society, our building, our property, our various physical assets, are owned collectively as a corporation controlled by the Board of Trustees, which represents the members of the Ethical Society who are ultimately the real owners of this place. Now, I'm very glad to say that this ends my attempt to explain legal liability and property rights, because while some legal scholars may get a kick out of it, it's very important. It's extremely important. But when I started to get into the weeds, my eyes glazed over, and I couldn't go very far with it. But I do want to say that that again is a sign of my privilege. The fact that I can rely on somebody else to take care of the liability, somebody else to look after my investments, bankers and so on, is a sign of being that privilege, that I don't have to think too hard about that. So I want to thank the board members for stepping forward. It's a weighty responsibility to be the legal representation. So I'd just like to take a minute to acknowledge the board, and if you're a board member in this room, would you mind standing and accept some applause from us all? Thank you. Appreciate that. Now let me turn to some broader philosophical elements about ownership. Justifying ownership. Let's start with that. Now, like many of you, I grew up accepting the idea of property rights as a given. A lot of this paradigm came from John Locke, who years ago argued that human beings were dropped into a state of nature, an environment of abundance where we could seize and make use of anything that wasn't being used by somebody else. In this model, we could grab food or objects for tools, because abundance in this sort of story that Locke told made a regulatory system unnecessary. There was so much stuff you could just grab whatever you wanted. In search of food, Locke talked about the fact that we might have seen an apple, but had we waited for some legal person responsibility or some system to come say, yes, you can have it, we would, according to Locke, find that, quote, man had starved, notwithstanding the plenty that God had given him. So Locke assumes that we can wander around and just take what we want if nobody else is using it at the time. And this is very convenient for acquisitive cultures like ourselves. And it was used to justify taking land from indigenous populations. Because a particularly pernicious element of Locke's system was the belief that if land was not actively being used, then no one owned it and it could be taken. It was vacant. It was based on the English concept of vacuum domicilium, which means empty home, which they used to justify seizure and occupation of land. Now, from the viewpoint of many Native American tribes, who were, sometimes they were hunter-gatherers, not always, but they didn't do as much fencing in of land and constant cultivation of large plots, and this legal fiction was devastating to them. I mean, you all know this, but there was a book I found called In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 worst Indian law cases ever decided. And in it, an attorney named Walter Echo Hawke described how the plundering Europeans basically viewed the situation. So this is his description of the European perspective. Native land is a wasteland or a savage wilderness that no one owns, uses, or wants, and is available for the taking by the colonists. Therefore, any aboriginal interests in the land are extinguished as soon as British subjects settle the area. Native people have no concept of property, do not claim any property rights, and are incapable of owning land. Christians have a right to take land from non-Christians because heathens lack property rights. So you can see how this attitude was easily transferred to a justification for stealing land, and it really brings into my mind the idea of whether you can ever justify property. How do you do that? Now, one alternative is to simply treat all property as jointly owned, common ownership. But this brings in its own set of problems. Many of you know what's known as the tragedy of the commons. Now, that theory basically said that it's not easy to manage common land because if it's open to unrestricted use by anybody, nobody really looks after it. So if you imagine that they suddenly designated Rittenhouse Square, if the Friends of Rittenhouse Square ceased to exist and we could just do what we wanted on Rittenhouse Square, it could be a baseball diamond, it could be used for farming, it could be neighborhood farms, it could be a dog park, and all that wonderful things that brings. But soon, that land would become almost unusable without anybody managing it. So, without somebody taking responsibility for it, it may not survive. And that's one of the justifications in our culture for private ownership. Because if not done well, if it's not owned by any particular people. Locke had a theory of labor theory of property that explains that when someone brings a resource out of the wilderness and makes use of it, he, quote, mixes his labor with the object, making it worth more. So this value that's added to an object helps others, and this is a good thing. So if I were to wander into the woods and cut down a tree and make a canoe, I could use it to flourish, and my children could use it. So this is a value added, and in some ways that's kind of the American ethos. That you take the wilderness and you carve it. Emerson wrote about this, channeling the waters and using materials for our own good. And that this is a positive thing. People would write about how it could foster hard work and industry and responsibility when you own things. Way back in Greece, Aristotle argued that private property promoted virtue. He said that responsible ownership was part of what it was to be a citizen. And it became part of our national story in the United States. The Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford explained that giving land to every white family, note the little asterisk there, had, quote, very good success for it made all hands very industrious. So as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So, from that perspective, not only did ownership help develop virtue, many began assuming that the ownership of property meant that you were ethical. That somehow having lots of stuff showed that you were an upstanding citizen, and that you were blessed by God. I mean, John D. Rockefeller said that, quote, God gave me my money. Right? So this belief that owning property can develop virtue began to lead to a very, again, negative attitude toward it. There's a lot of ethical challenges with this. For example, if you really do believe that, then are the poor responsible for their lot? Are they less moral than those with property? And that's what many Americans believed in the 1800s, in particular, under something called the Gospel of Wealth, which believed that wealth and virtue were naturally tied, and the poor were blamed for their poverty. So again, this sort of religious sanctification of property led to some pretty awful attitudes. In fact, Aristotle went so far as to say that people who are enslaved don't aspire to virtue because they don't belong to themselves. Now listen to how this reasoning goes. He said that only free men benefit from virtue directly because it improves something they own, their soul. So if you don't own your soul, you cannot try to acquire virtue. Why would you? Where would it go? So this led to an exclusion of whole groups of people for moral consideration. not even to be counted in the moral calculus. And such individuals, exploiters claim, didn't own themselves so they could be treated as property. And you know how the story goes. Now, more broadly, some people saw the problem with property in general, and Plato was a philosopher that talked about the dangers of property, that it corrupts, that when we attach ourselves to physical objects, we lose sight of the incorporeal ideals of justice and goodness and truth. And it's for that reason that Plato believed that we should have our rulers be the philosopher kings, people who have given up all of their property because they care more about ideas than stuff. It reminds me a little bit of the idea that Buddhist monks believe that once you break your attachment to the physical world, you will naturally be more ethical. That the shallowness of materialism is what corrupts us. Now, I'm in that shallow water because I got lots of stuff. So it's hard. The idea that material stuff is based on illusion, our ownership of it is based on illusion, is what the Buddhist wisdom is trying to press. All we actually own, they say, is the present moment. Right now, in experience. That's all we really have. Ownership of stuff is just a symptom of our over-attachment to property. So is it folly for me to try to spend my time acquiring and managing my property? The Buddha once said, "A fool suffers, thinking, I have children, I have wealth. Oneself is not even one's own. How then are children? How then is wealth?" But even if we accept Locke's premise that maintaining property can help us be virtuous, we don't have to accept that the way we've acquired property has been virtuous or ethical. Because Locke assumes that there's some sort of egalitarian starting point where we're just dropped into nature and people gather property. And David Hume, even, who had some cynicism about private property, said that he thought property was necessary for civilization, but he didn't try to justify that it came into existence ethically. He said that the battle for resources occurred well before legal frameworks of property were developed. Legal definitions of ownership were developed when the control of resources was already unequal. So picking an arbitrary moment to say that that's our starting point simply favored early plunderers, people who got their stuff first. Jean-Jacques Rousseau commented on this arbitrary and unethical birth of property rights. He said, "The first man who has enclosed a piece of ground bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if once you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" Property, when divorced from social obligation, according to Rousseau, was the root of all evil. Now, as capitalism tended to generate more crimes and wars and murders, radicals began to attack it, the very nature of property. The anarchist Proudhon was the one who coined the phrase, "property is theft." And Karl Marx, while he agreed with some of the spirit behind Proudhon, actually rejected the anarchists. He said such a phrase is illogical. Because you can only have theft if you have property. So he threw that away. But in 1848, when Marx began to write the Communist Manifesto, he developed what was his approach to property, and that was we should eliminate private property. And what he meant by that was ownership of the means of production. Farms, factories, tractors, and so forth. Not personal property. He allowed for that. In the 1860s, he developed what was called the surplus value of labor. And this theory took one of Locke's premises, and that was that when we take stuff from the natural world and we put our time and effort into it, we enhance its values, and we actually fuse part of ourselves with this object. That's when it's ours, when we put in our time and energy to it. And Marx saw the problem with capitalism was That as somebody with capital would build a factory, the person making the chair that took him 1 hour as a craftsman, he can now make 10 chairs in an hour. But all that surplus value that the factory added was given to the owner. So the person making the chair basically was always making subsistence wages. And that surplus value was appropriated by the owner completely to themselves. That was Marx's approach. Now, the worker who puts his energy into this is then alienated from themselves because their sweat and their blood and their toil are in the product and it's taken by somebody else. So their very soul is taken from them. And that seems a little grandiose, but imagine if you were in an artist co-op and you painted a self-portrait or a portrait of your family, and then the person who bought the co-op for you comes by and takes the painting by and walks away. It's really like he's taking a part of you away. And that's something interesting about property, that even Marx understood, that we identify our very identity with the stuff that we own. Now, this is obviously, when you step back from things and take the broad view, problematic. A lot of indigenous cultures offer a very different perspective that looks at things like how we could possibly own the earth, the sea, or the sky. So at our Thanksgiving meal, we quite often have one of the children actually reads one of these quotes. The first is from the Sioux that say, "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents, it was loaned to you by your children." We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Or as Chief Seattle was supposedly said, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land?" This idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air or the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. So there's this realization that there's a sacredness to things that we lose when we begin to acquire and manage and defend. And given the dysfunctional state of our relationships with the planet, the fact that we are on the verge of eliminating our species due to our own approach to property, maybe we need to adapt that more broader, idealistic, and less exclusive approach to private property. Now, we do romanticize indigenous cultures because we like to say that communalism dominates all of their cultural. There are some indigenous groups that are very communal, but there's also acquisition and theft and fighting over resources as well. But I don't think it dominates those cultures nearly as it does ours, and it hurts us in a number of ways. So I want to talk about the price that we pay for these. I suffer again from a problem of privilege, and that is that I have too much stuff. I spend so much of my time managing it. It crowds in upon me. It takes away my freedom, or I feel it does. It might be bad faith that I say that. But do you get sometimes wrapped up where you feel like your day is just dealing with your stuff? House repairs, car repairs, organizing things, giving away clothing, their tax returns. It's all about the stuff that we have. We may think that we own property, but it feels like it owns us. Bertrand Russell said that it's the preoccupation with possessions more than anything else that prevents us from living freely and nobly. Now, one of my heroes, Gandhi, described possessions as a prison. And this was a man who didn't have more than 8 items to his personal possession when he died. But he believed that possessions were eating up his life when he was a young barrister and when he took tap dancing lessons and wore a tuxedo and violin lessons. He was into the material world, but he said that he began to see that ethics was getting shortchanged. So he said, "I discarded everything immediately. I must confess to you that progress was at first slow. And now as I recall those days of struggle, I remember that it was also painful in the beginning. But soon I can say a great burden fell off my shoulders, and I felt that I could now walk with ease and do my work in the service of my fellow men with great comfort and still greater joy." Now, we don't follow the lessons of Gandhi. I don't, at least. Not as much as I think I'd like to or think I do. And there's a lot of irony to the world, because if you go to New Delhi, you go to the National Gandhi Museum, you can buy a pair of his, a replica of his glasses for $8, or a replica of his watch for 12. And at a recent auction of his glasses and some of his final possessions, the bidding started at $10,000 and went up to $2 million in less than 5 minutes. So that's an odd postscript to Gandhi's vow of poverty. So, what possesses us, what possesses me, to focus so much on this material stuff? That we sacrifice other parts of ourselves and of our experience. Why do we trade our souls for stuff? Ralph Waldo Emerson bemoaned the fact that men have looked away from themselves and at things for so long that they have come to esteem the religious, learned, and civil institutions as guards of property. They measure their esteem and of each other by what each one has, not by what each one is. Now, one particular student of Emerson dedicated his life to offering this other way. You know him, Ethical Culture's founder, Felix Adler, decried what he said was drifting on the seething tide of business, each one absorbed, holding his own in the giddy race of competition, all caught up in the hot and hasty pursuit of affairs in the hours of labor and the chase of pleasures in the hours of leisure, mesmerized by the bazaars of fashion and the physical stimulus of wine and food. It's as if we believe that we're in this race for acquisition. It's like we think that whoever dies with the most toys wins. Now, according to Adler, we don't have a right to that, let alone is it self-destructive. He admits that we should have what we need in order to flourish. He never took a vow of poverty. But beyond that, he didn't think there was a right. He wrote, quote, "No one has a property right in harmful or superfluous luxuries." And he was writing this at a time when the robber barons were showing how wonderful they were as people by owning as much stuff as they possibly could. In a chapter he wrote called "The Right to Property," Adler explains, "Without an ethical standard, without the notion of an end to be subserved, stubborn possession will always be able to resist modification." And I just imagine when I hear that, like we're little kids just holding on to our stuff. We just don't want to let it go. And we're caught up in this feverish addiction to the material world. And then we act surprised when we're preoccupied by it. Bound up by our possessions, the broader horizons of life seem to elude us. And in the past, the main alternative to this stubborn materialism was, frankly, traditional religion. Despite the various materialistic elements of religions, it was faith institutions that reminded us always to not put all our eggs in the materialist basket. These religions warned us that a physical life is just a drop in the ocean of time, that we should not spend our precious moments mesmerized by possessions, and that by cultivating goodness and justice and virtue, we best prepare ourselves for the life thereafter. That was the message. But for Adler and many in this room, we focus on this one life that we have, here and now. While you can agree with the traditional believers that you can't take it with you, it means very different things. We don't invest in gilded cathedrals as a down payment to eternal life. We try to focus on the lived relationships that we have in this life. And for Adler and for us, the material world that is a means. It's not an end in itself. Property should be helped to put ethics at the center of our lives. That's what he taught. Piling up possessions does not nurture ethical personality, so it does not, in Adler's view and in my view, justify a goal itself as a goal of life. So the title of my talk today, "What Do You Really Own Anyway?" is obviously a bit of a challenge. It challenges us to remember this simple truth, that we're just brief visitors in this world that means so much to us. We can get caught up in ownership, our exclusive right and control over property, but underneath we know that our control is extremely limited. We're, like many indigenous cultures counsel, merely borrowing things for a brief time. I mean, you can just go down to your go down to the nearest dump and just look at all this stuff, the mountains of stuff that's just thrown away there that at one point were guarded preciously as possessions. We come here to honor the worth of every individual, to strive for social justice through our most distinguishing characteristic, and that is the emphasis on strong relationships that bring out the best. And to see this and come here for that is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. The challenge to accept our vulnerability and our fragile existence in time and space. We're challenged to open our eyes and to see a world that's broken, a world where so many have too little and we have so much. And we're challenged to accept responsibility for healing this world. The concept of tikkun olam, which is at the heart of Reform Judaism, in which Adler grew up. This is part of our heritage. It's a type of ownership that I'm going to end with, and it's a type of ownership that means owning responsibility. We use it all the time that way, but we don't think of it this way. In a committee meeting, you might say, who owns this project? And what we mean is, who's going to take responsibility for carrying this forward? A sense of obligation feels very, very much like lost in our world today. We are more consumers of property than we are stewards nurturing this world. Building an ethical culture is about building a collective future. It's about owning responsibility for that future and not just being tossed around in the materialist world. In a new book Harry Thorne recommended, I started to read The Future of Capitalism by Paul Collier. It centers on the need for ownership for our shared project of building civilization. We're caught in a downward spiral without that. You see it in our politics today. Collier writes, new rifts are tearing apart the social fabric of the United States and other Western societies. Thriving cities versus rural counties, the highly skilled versus the less educated, wealthy versus developing countries. And as these divides deepen, we have lost the sense of ethical obligation to others that was crucial to the rise of post-war social democracy. So far, these rifts have been answered only by the revivalist ideologies of populism and socialism, leading to the seismic upheaval of Trump, Brexit, and the return of the far right in Germany. So this small effort today of me to try to push us back into understanding what owning obligations is about is the heart of my work here. This type of ownership that I promote is about taking responsibility for the social fabric. And to do that, we cannot let property get in the way of owning these ethical relationships. So as we move on after this meeting to our pledge luncheon, I want to thank all of you for contributing to that sense of shared ownership and a dedication to an ideal that is greater than owning stuff. Thank you very much.